Um, Hello and welcome back to the Not Your Neurotypical Fitness podcast. And we have got an absolutely freaking amazing guest on today that I am so excited to speak to about. And it's something really important. Today's is not the most, well, we're still gonna have fun and we're still gonna have a good laugh, but it's something really not spoken about enough. And when I came across Hannah actually because I was on a course about eating disorders and ADHD, and Hannah had an amazing talk as part of that. And it was just fabulous to find someone raising awareness of this slightly darker side of ADHD, but something that does need more awareness. So, Hannah, I'm not going to butcher it. Are you able to just do a quick intro into who you are, the amazing work that you do, and then we'll get a little bit into your story because it's absolutely incredible.
Thank you. Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me on. I was actually very starstruck when you messaged me because a lot of my friends who have ADHD follow you, and I was
Oh,
like, oh my
no
God, I can't
way,
believe
really?
I have been asked on the podcast. Yeah, so that's very cool. But yeah, so my name's Hannah. I'm the host of Full of Beans, which is an eating disorder awareness podcast. So I started that about 5.5 years ago now. I didn't really get the best treatment for my eating disorder, and I just thought I can't be alone in this. And so I wanted to have conversations with other people to just kind of share their stories and hope that that would, help people find something that they could relate to. I've also done some work in eating disorder research. I worked in an eating disorder clinic, and now I dip my toe in and out of research, do some stuff, as you've said, with ADHD, but I also work in digital marketing. So it's a whole host of random things, which I think, as we said before we started, it goes with the ADHD brain of having several
Yeah, I
things.
was gonna say that's all you need to know. Tell me you've got ADHD without saying it. You do 101 things at one time. Incredible. To start today, though, I'd love to kind of explore your story with eating disorders and kind of where it came into your life and how you became aware of it, because everyone's journey with disordered eating is so unique and so different. It has a lot of stigma, doesn't it? That it's a certain kind of person and it's a certain journey, but I think it's so, as you'll know yourself with your podcast, everyone has their own experiences. It isn't just people with trauma, it isn't just people from certain backgrounds. So where did it all really start for you? What's your kind of earliest core memory of it all kicking off for yourself in your world?
So it's really interesting, I guess, now retrospectively, knowing that I have ADHD, I can see so many points in my life where I'm like, yeah. I mean, I don't think that it's solely just having ADHD that meant that I had an eating disorder, but I think there's several traits and characteristics that led to then thinking maybe controlling food or my body was the answer. But I think when people say like, oh, when did it all start for you? Like, I don't really have a memory without it because I think for me, I've always been, even I remember starting primary school and I was always very conscious of my leg size compared to the other little girls or like what I had in my lunchbox compared to what the other girls had. So I think it's always been very present in terms of recognizing that I didn't feel comfortable in my body and also recognizing that I was different in the fact of like what my body looked like to other people. I also have a half brother and sister, and our body types when I was younger were very different. So I'm 5'1", my brother is 6'5". My brother was a beanpole as a teenager, and even though he's 10 years older than me, my figure was kind of, I was shorter and I wasn't as, skinny or what have you as they were. So I think from an early age, I recognized even in my family, I was different. And there was always a lot of comments around the slim people in our family and that almost being better. And so I think that's probably like where it first developed. But in terms of like actually kind of getting a diagnosis of the eating disorder, when I was 14, I was diagnosed with atypical anorexia, which, if people don't know what that means, basically, it's when you have all the characteristics of anorexia nervosa, so the food restriction, the thoughts about body image and food, not really having an awareness of how poorly you are and that kind of drive to lose weight. But my BMI wasn't less than 18.5. And now, I mean, at the time, all I wanted to do as a A-star student who was, such a perfectionist that, had to be the best at everything she did, all I wanted to do was get an anorexia diagnosis. And so to be told I was atypical, where I already felt like I didn't fit in with, my siblings, I felt very different at school. That was like the biggest kick in the face that you've ever received in your life. And so I just instantly disengaged from treatment because it was like, you don't understand what I'm going through. Like, I am really struggling here, but I just felt like a joke, basically. So I had a bit of treatment, but I didn't really last very long, to be honest. Which then led to I tried to do some recovery at home with my parents on my own. But ultimately, like something I'm very passionate about talking about, eating disorders aren't about food. Food is the behavioral part of it, and that's kind of the part that you use to communicate to others, I'm not okay, or I'm going to use this to kind of self-destruct, but actually it's the emotions underneath that you need to sort. And if you don't have therapy for that, it can get to a point where you're navigating day-to-day life, you look fine, people think that you're okay, but underneath that voice in your head is still ever present, telling you you're not enough, and just every kind of consuming thought about food and body. And that's kind of what happened for several years until I went to uni where I found powerlifting. And that was the first time I ever made friends that I felt like I really fit in. I was like, oh my God, I found my people. And now looking back, I think it was probably because powerlifting really lends itself for people that like routines and structure and they like things to be, uh, very in place. So it probably was that there was more people in that group that were neurodivergent, which I then connected to. But at the time, I was very much focused on these are my friends because I'm good at sport and because my body looks a certain way and this, that, and the other. And so I just fell into not necessarily restricting my food intake, but I was restricting it in a sense of only eating in a certain way that would allow me to thrive in sport.
Yeah.
And that just went on for a very long time. And I would kind of ebb and flow in and out of disordered eating and compulsive exercise. But because I looked physically well, nobody questioned it. I was just kind of deemed as, oh, it's amazing how dedicated Hannah is to her sport. And she's so disciplined. She gets up at 6 a.m. and she'll push herself. And isn't it great that she can like avoid cake because she's so passionate about her training? And also, when I was competing, I would reduce my I'd cut down to a weight category to be more competitive. And those behaviors are so disordered and restrictive, but they were just normalized. Everybody did them. So that really didn't help with things. And then when COVID hit, obviously the whole world just went into disarray. Nobody knew what was going on. We couldn't control anything. I couldn't get to the gym, so the only thing I could do was exercise at home and not eat. And so that just became my cycle of coping. And so I relapsed quite badly then. I'd say what even worse so than so I relapsed at 18 and I kind of relapsed worse at 25. And I just thought at that point, I was like, I never thought I'd get back here again. I never thought that this would be my life again. And I just thought, that's it. Like, third time, I'm basically stuck here forever. My friendships fell apart, my relationship fell apart, everything was really on the brink. And I started with a therapist, and the first time ever she asked me about my emotions and how I was feeling. And I was just like, wow, this isn't about just being able to eat cake and go for a burger. This is about so much more.
Yeah.
And she was the one that diagnosed me with ADHD.
Amazing.
Um, and from then, I don't want to say it was like fingers clicked, everything's sorted, super fine, but everything just started to make a little bit more sense as to why the eating disorder was so attractive and helped so much.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting that story because there was so much that I resonated with that I'd almost forgotten about. So the first thing you said when you went that first time when you went and got the diagnosis and almost felt you weren't taken serious, like you almost weren't a good enough anorexic. I remember feeling like that because I remember engaging with, I mean, it's, I don't know what it's like now, but all like the different like accounts and the pro Anna and all this, and it was almost glamorized going to hospital and
Yeah.
this, that, and the other. And I was just same as you, like underweight, but not you're gonna die sort of thing. And it almost got made to feel like you were not good enough, which obviously then kind of fuels it more. And it was a perpetual cycle. And I remember I it felt like I'd recovered, but it was like a mass recovery because I kind of just followed the plan. And
Yeah.
then I fell into uni and I went in the other cycle of actually binge eating at uni. And then I found the gym and fitness, and very similar to you, I then lost the weight and I was channeling it into something healthy and productive. And look how disciplined she is. And it's a healthy way of doing it now, but it absolutely wasn't. And nothing felt like I'd actually been truly like fixed. There was always something. And it was that ADHD diagnosis. And I don't know if you can resonate, but it almost just felt like the missing piece of the puzzle, like a
Mm.
light bulb moment that makes everything make sense. And I think the same for me, it was like that actually allowed me to move forward and make sense of it. Whereas before, I don't know about you, but almost just nothing quite ever. You see other people's recovery stories and but nothing ever felt like it was quite clicking for me. And I don't know if you felt the same on that.
Yeah. I think like to your original point about the like being good enough, I was actually speaking to somebody about this the other day and we said, what is a good enough anorexic?
Mm.
And ultimately there's one answer and that's, a really, really tragic answer. But no matter what weight you get to, what behaviors you engage in, you never feel like you're enough and the goalpost is continuously moving. So I definitely found it was something that almost lured me in as a friend and then very quickly became your worst enemy. But after struggling with anorexia for 10 plus years, you don't know any different. That is your safety mechanism. So even though it's really, really hurting you and hurting everyone around you, you don't know kind of what else to lean into. And I guess to your point about the ADHD like clicking into place and it being like the puzzle, I agree on some respects and I really disagree on others
Okay.
in the fact of when I was originally diagnosed, I totally agree. Like it was like, oh my God, everything makes sense. Like I've been starving myself because there's so much chaos in my brain, and if I don't have the energy to have the chaos, I'm just numb, and I don't have to experience the like all the different symptoms that ADHD brings that are sometimes very positive, but also can sometimes be challenging. And so in the moment when I was in recovery, it was really, really useful to be like, okay, yes, I have ADHD. That's why I never felt like I fit into friendship groups. That's why I was so obsessed with one person in the friendship group and wanted them to be my best friend rather than having lots of different friends. Or, that's why I throw myself into things and then after a couple of weeks, hours, depending on what it is, I literally don't care anymore. That's why I've cycled through jobs because I'm so excited at the high of getting the job and being told I'm good enough. But then when I actually do the job, it's boring.
Mhm.
So that really helped to be able to give myself compassion. What I think didn't help, and is something I'm now really passionate about in helping other people, is that if you're diagnosed with ADHD during recovery, you very much look at it through the lens of the intersection between ADHD and an eating disorder. So,
Mm.
how has my ADHD impacted my eating disorder development, or how is it kind of what are the traits that ADHD kind of make me susceptible to developing an eating disorder? So then when you don't have the eating disorder anymore, you're like, okay, that's cool, but I'm still struggling with my ADHD.
Mm.
And so I feel like that's very much where I am at the moment is the one coping mechanism I used, which, as I said before, was very unhealthy, very, detrimental to my life. But if I'm being honest, worked to manage my ADHD. I now don't have that. And so for me, it's been so difficult now living with ADHD because I'm still struggling. And I think that there's this big idea, and I should probably say as well that I'm currently in the process of being the diagnosis process for autism as well,
Mhm.
which I think has just thrown another thing into the pot of like, here's another thing for you to understand and consider and like work out how this plays in your life. But I very much thought that recovery from an eating disorder would mean that I would walk outside when I was recovered and it would always be sunny and there'd be flowers and I'd eat cake for breakfast and I would have no worries. I would look in the mirror and think, oh my God, I'm so beautiful, what have you. And that's just not the reality. Yes, there are good days, but there are also bad days. And I think that now the bad days with the ADHD still happen. I still get overwhelmed with emotions. I still kind of, feel the imposter syndrome. And that's been something that's been so difficult for me because the anorexic voice that told me I wasn't enough, I needed to lose weight, I was eating too much, and really ruminated around every single food choice or every single outfit choice now exists in day-to-day life. So I haven't kind of worked yet, which this is something I am working on managing that kind of
Mm.
internal critic or whatever you want to call it, because it's just morphed into something else. So
Sure.
it's something I'm really passionate about talking about because I think a lot of people will just focus on eating disorder recovery and not kind of replace that coping mechanism.
Mm.
But I think it is really important to, if you know that you have ADHD or autism, to make sure that you have new strategies in place because otherwise it just kind of morphs into something else.
Oh, 100%. I think that was the downfall in my initial recovery was that I didn't truly understand my brain and how it works. And then that's when I was like, well, I'm just going to now cope with like bodybuilding and it looks healthy on the surface. And then I was in cycles of burnout with my business. And I think the way to look at it, I think you're absolutely 100% like, well, I remember this idea of recovery because they think it's on pictures, recovery, and you think of flowers and sunshine, and everything's just happy, happy, happy. And I like to think of it as it's like you're now stable. Now it's learning. Now the next chapter is how do you then manage that without it? And I guess you could link it into, eating disorders are very similar in nature to addiction, alcohol and drugs. And when that person, comes away from the danger zone, which is the beauty, and that's what we think recovery is, they're out of the danger zone, but they've still got to learn to cope and channel it in a different way. And it's the exact same with eating disorders. So when ADHD came into your life, if you remember, if you do remember, because I know I remember the first time someone planted a seed, I laughed it off because in my head I was like, ADHD is the little chaotic boys running around causing chaos. And originally it was like an in joke with some people that I worked with, and I was like, no. And it was one day when there was someone who was more external to sort of like my friendship group who said it to me, and it was almost like this, oh. Okay. And like as you do, you start to research it. So do you remember your first initial thoughts when that seed was planted? Was it a, oh my God, maybe? Or did you have the same thoughts of me of like, no, no,
Yeah.
since the naughty little boys disease, not disease, sorry, illness and mental disorder. And no, it's not me. All these thoughts and preconceptions, because obviously in women, it's better now, but how many years ago it was for us when we were diagnosed, it was so misunderstood, like the narratives and of what it looked like and what it actually meant and what it was.
Yeah. No, that's literally I mean, it's really interesting because my therapist said to me, have you ever considered ADHD? And I did exactly what you said, like, no, of course I haven't. Like, how can I possibly have ADHD? Um, and then I thought, maybe I should look into this a bit more. And then at the same time, two of my best friends who I'd kind of recently at that time become close to. And there was something about them that we just clicked. Like our energy just, we were on the same level. And they both mentioned that they were getting diagnosed with ADHD. And I was like, um, why though? Because like one of them was she was always late, but the other one, she was so well put together. She managed life so incredibly well. And I was just like, you don't fidget, you don't butt in people's conversations. Like, I guess you do hyper focus on things, but and then she started telling me about the symptoms that she experienced and that they were ADHD. And I was like, what? No, like, are you sure? Um, And so I did my own research and I started reading about ADHD in women, and how a lot of it is internal rather than external. So the initially, like, the first symptoms that we'll recognize in boys tend to be external, like as you said, like, fidgeting and needing to burn off lots of energy and constantly being on the move and chatty and what have you. Whereas with girls, they do tend to be on the quieter side because it's all internal and it's that kind of chaotic voice inside their head rather than on their body, people pleasing, like, wanting to be the best and trying to prove yourself all the time. And so I was like, okay, maybe there is something here. And so I went for the diagnosis and I got diagnosed with ADHD. But I didn't really do anything with it. I didn't really think about it. I kind of just, I guess at the time, and I feel really bad saying this, but obviously there has been a rise in people getting diagnosed with ADHD. So I kind of just felt like I was just like everyone else. I
Yeah.
didn't really think about anything. Um, and then I also was so focused on my eating disorder recovery that I didn't really have the space to be like, what do I actually think of this?
Yeah.
Like, how does this make me feel? Or what does this mean for me? And so it was like a month ago, I said to my mum, I was like, I don't think I've actually got ADHD, by the way. And she was like, what do you mean? I was like, well, I don't remember getting a document or piece of paper from the psychiatrist. So I think maybe I just made it up. And she was like, Hannah, I literally remember reading the report. And I went back through my emails and I found the document and I was like, oh my God, like, yeah, it's official. Um, but I think I was so kind of in the moment of recovery that I guess I didn't want to kind of sit and think, what does this mean for me?
Mm.
Um, and I guess in a way, maybe I had some stigma attached to it of like, what does this mean to me? And all that time that you lose not knowing that you have ADHD, all of those situations where you felt like you weren't enough or you weren't adequate and you felt just pushed out from things. If I'd have known I had ADHD, would I have been able to sort of navigate those situations differently? I think there's a massive grieving process that comes with ADHD when you get diagnosed of all that time lost. But then equally, on the flip side of that, I know that everything I've achieved in my life is because the ADHD makes me so driven. And when I am passionate about something like eating disorders, I go to the nth degree to kind of achieve, and I want, like, that's my passion. I want to help people. So it's a tricky one. And I've gone on a massive tangent. I can't even remember what we were talking about, but
Yeah, well, it's ADHD. But that whole, I saw someone phrase it as re-grief, like it's relief and grief at the same time. And I think that's the most beautiful way of
Mm,
phrasing it. Because I remember getting, Lucy, you've got combined ADHD. I remember that phrase, clear as day. And I had the same thoughts as you. And I remember umming and ahhing, like, do I say something on social media? Like, I feel like I should. I've always had values of transparency. But it was that time when it was more women are getting diagnosed, and I was like, oh, people are going to think I'm jumping on the bandwagon, and people not going to believe me. And then I thought, no, I'm going to just be honest, just if it helps someone, cool. And then it was just like this, like flood of, I feel relieved, I feel sad, I feel, upset for the past self, and all these memories, just random memories, just start coming back to you where you're like, oh, that was the ADHD, that was that. But then the exact same, for me, I'm always a solution focused person with everything that I do. Like bad things are going to happen, but what do we do about it? And I had the same thought process as you, but if we look at the positives of like the hyper focus and the, fixations and the drive, I wouldn't be doing this cool stuff
mm.
had I not had it. Now, on coming back to the eating disorder side, and something that I can relate to you on, and I've heard in your story on the talk and all this on the website, you mentioned, and you mentioned a few times today, not feeling truly supported. Like you tick the box with the recovery, but you didn't really have that support, and now you're passionate about helping people to do the same. So, what did that actually mean for you, and where do you feel like the support was lacking? Was it underfunding? Was it not truly understanding? Like, where do you feel the gaps were on your journey of recovery specifically?
I mean, I think all of the above to what you've just said and more. I think that And I want to say as well before I say this, like I know that the people that are working to help people with eating disorders, it is not their intention to cause harm or to make someone feel like they're not supported. Unfortunately, we have a system that is flawed, that is underfunded. There's not enough people, there's not enough training. And I've worked with several of these people, and every time I speak to somebody, they have so much compassion and care. But unfortunately, the system we have is very much a sweeping statement in terms of how to help people. And when someone's struggling with an eating disorder, we can say that there's different reasons as to why an eating disorder develops, but for every single person, that's going to be so different. And also, recovery looks so different for everybody as well, which is something I really had to get my head around in my own recovery. Because if somebody was recovered and I was like, I don't think that you seem recovered, I had to like really take a step back and stay in my own lane and be like, no, Hannah, you have an idea of what recovery looks like for you. Maybe you won't, maybe that won't actually what it looks like, but they're doing their own recovery and that's individual to them. But I think in terms of the support, um, it is fundamentally, it just comes down to the lack of resources and the lack of funding, which means then people are burnt out, people don't have the right training, people are worried about saying the wrong thing. And, I think there's so much research. Well, so much. There's the research that we have is looking into, different treatment modalities and the way that different eating disorders present and this, that, and the other. But I personally think, ultimately, when you're supporting someone with an eating disorder, you just have to get to know the individual. And
It's
then you have to bring in lots of different treatment modalities. You have to trial and error. Some things are going to work, some things won't. And for me, emotion focused therapy was the best thing because I didn't understand my emotions. So I thought there was euphoria, depression, and boredom. Turns out there's a whole load of more emotions than that. And I remember my therapist showing me the like emotion wheel, and I was like, how does one person feel all of that? Um, because I just could not kind of relate to them or know how to put that into words. But by being able to kind of track my emotions and learn more about them, I was then able to communicate what was happening rather than just leaning into the eating disorder. But emotion focused therapy might not work for somebody else. But I think that's where private practice does well because it has the time and the resources to be able to provide that individualized treatment. But unfortunately, in the NHS, we don't have that. And I know that I come from a very privileged place of being able to afford private therapy, which I personally think that sort of individualized treatment should be accessible to everybody because I don't believe that eating disorders are terminal. I think everybody has the potential to recover, but for some people, it takes a lot longer. For some people, they require a lot more support and a lot more intervention. But it's just about finding that thing that either, sparks their motivation to recover. Because I do think as well in eating disorders, often people will say you've got to want to recover.
yeah,
I think that's a really interesting concept because I do believe that you have to want to recover because ultimately you have to be the one to make that decision to change your life. But when I first started recovery, I wasn't doing it because I was doing it for myself. I started doing it because I couldn't I mean my relationship was on the brink and just something inside of me was like, oh my God, if I don't do this, I'm going to lose him. But also I have two cats and I was just like I don't want to be ill for them. Like I want to be able to look after them. And it sounds like crazy to say that the cats were the thing that got me to recover, but I think if you can do it for something else at first, because often, you have a difficult relationship with yourself when you're in it,
yeah,
then you do get to a point where you're like, ah, life is actually, I've noticed a shift. Like
sure.
I'm doing a bit more of the things that I enjoy. I'm connecting with people more. And you realize that it's so little about the food and so much more about what just thinking a little bit less about food or your body can offer you and what it allows you to kind of get involved with and stuff like that. So, in answer to your question, and again, I've gone on a tangent, I think it is really about you have to look at that on an individual basis in terms of what people's motivations are, what their difficulties are, And that's just unfortunately not something that is currently available. Maybe in some services it is, but I think again it's kind of the postcode lottery in terms of what the service has been kind of composed of in order to help people.
Absolutely. And I guess this is where as well, if we can, you know, that with the work that we do and other people can really work on almost that idea of helping people understand the different reasons as to why it happens, that prevention over cure, idea. I think that's really, and raising that awareness, that's one way we can do it. And you are so right in terms of that individual like level. And what was really interesting for me is I only really felt like I understood the reasons as to why I struggled with my relationship with food and body through private practices, but it was actually outside of eating disorder recovery because it was a few years later I'd done some like mental performance mindset coaching. And this mindset coach was amazing. He helped me understand that I'd spent at the time I didn't know it was ADHD, and then years down the line, I was like, that makes sense. I felt very like the black sheep. I felt very like I didn't belong anywhere. And then when I started to lose weight, people notice you, boys notice you, you get compliments. And so I attach self-worth to my body and feeling like I belong somewhere and that I don't feel like this dark shadow that's sat on the outside. And that was why I struggled so much. It was nothing to do with wanting to be a size 4 or that I enjoyed not eating. I love food. I'm a foodie. I love a good biscuit. I love a good cake. So why? It was that feeling, that core human need of wanting to belong. And I personally, and we can explore this in a second. I think this is potentially one of the biggest correlations with anorexia, and anorexia particularly, and disordered relationships with food and body and ADHD is well, when you are losing weight, and rightly or wrongly, people do have something positive to say. Males notice you more. You get compliments, you get more likes on your Facebook, on your Instagram.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden you get this sense of belonging. And when you don't know that you have ADHD and you just feel like an outsider, suddenly you don't. And that was why it took me years to let go. And for me, the only thing that ever truly allowed me to let go a few years ago was that knowing. That's why I needed to cling on to it so much.
Mhm.
But that, like you said, had that been private, maybe I'd have experienced that earlier on because it was all these different multifaceted understanding my relationship with myself and my it's so fascinating. It's so fascinating. Now, just on that note, because obviously you do a lot of work around eating disorders and understanding the relationship with neurodiversity and on an individual level, which is absolutely amazing. From when I first started researching, this was another reason I was like, oh, I don't have ADHD at first, and then I'd forgotten my whole past experience with binge eating. When they speak about disordered eating in ADHD, generally there is more literature and more narrative around the binge eating side of it, and binge eating disorder, which there is a massive correlation, and obviously it's really really sad. And there was very few people speaking about the relationship with it with anorexia. I couldn't find much literature. I couldn't find many people sharing that. And that was one reason when I saw your talk, I was like, thank you. Like it's amazing to hear it more because I apparently there's actually really big statistics around it and it's just not spoken about. So what is your sort of understanding of like the relationship between ADHD and anorexia? Because it's not that I don't care about binge eating disorder. I think it's huge, it's terrible, but I think there is more noise and research and people talking about it. And it'd be awesome just to kind of hear like what do you because obviously there is no one direct causation, but why do you think there is such a strong link with ADHD and anorexia?
I was actually reading a paper just before we came on today that was looking at the validity of the ADHD screening assessment and whether that is valid in eating sort of populations. Because obviously, you do have to consider that when somebody is engaging in, restrictive patterns or binging or what have you, that could then lead to ADHD-like characteristics. So it's the screening tools need to be validated to make sure that we're not kind of giving people an ADHD diagnosis. The same for autism as well, because if somebody is restricting, that can present with autistic-like tendencies.
Oh,
So you don't want to be giving somebody an ADHD diagnosis and then helping them with that if actually it's due to their behaviors. But the study did say that it was valid. But something I found really interesting in that was that um, they were less thinking about the hyperactivity tendencies and more about the impulsivity and linking that to excessive exercise.
Okay.
So I think that is a really interesting aspect because I personally struggled with excessive exercise, as I mentioned. And I think that, within that, it feeds into quite a few different aspects. And I will just say as well, what I'm explaining right now is my personal experience rather than research, because, as you said, it is very limited. But when I speak about it as well, this is also from speaking to people on my podcast and other people within the industry. There seems to be a general theme of, because we live in a society where there is a particular body type that is idealized, when you engage in excessive exercise or you engage in exercise, it's really interesting what you said about like you weren't trying to be a particular size and you were a foodie and you loved food. It was the kind of appreciation of your body that you wanted or the approval or, for people to be attracted to you. And I think that that makes sense, doesn't it? Because if we have come from a childhood where we've never quite felt like we fit in because there's something different about us, but you haven't been able to place it, controlling your body, I'm not saying that it's necessarily always easy to lose weight, but I think when you've got the drive and the hyperfocus like somebody has in ADHD, that is something that you can do. And so if you then start to recognize and that gets positive reinforcement, of course, you then continue to engage in those behaviors. But I think also for me, that was the place where I found my community. That was the place where I found my friends. And so, as I was mentioning earlier, like I linked my acceptance to the fact that I looked a certain way or I could lift a certain weight and that sort of thing. But on the flip side, and I think, also this is from lived experience, living with ADHD can be overwhelming sometimes, from the emotional dysregulation to like the executive dysfunction to going into town and being overwhelmed by stimulus to eating a food and feeling the food literally move through your body, then feeling bloated and that kind of overwhelming sensory experience. It all kind of makes sense as to why restriction is attractive because you suppress, if you think about the sensory side of things, if you're not eating a lot, you won't experience those sensory situations. And I think for me, the feeling of clothes on my skin was a very uncomfortable, difficult thing. And so if my clothes were baggy, I didn't have to experience that. And then also, things like burnout and fatigue, if in social situations or what have you, when you're ill with an eating disorder, you kind of have a pass to not go to a social situation. And so it was just easy to say, oh no, I'm feeling really tired, I'm not going to come. And so you can just retreat in and not have to engage with people outside, which for a lot of people, social situations and things like that can be really uncomfortable. So I think, as you said, the research is so limited. There are suggestions that there's less kind of correlation between ADHD and anorexia and ADHD and binge eating disorder. But I do wonder, is that because when people are engaged in the eating disorder, the ADHD is quite quiet?
Mm.
um, and whether it seems like there's more of a correlation to binge eating and bulimia because the ADHD actually kind of almost heightens the ADHD. I remember speaking to someone on my podcast who said that, for him, he would go out all day and he'd mask and then he'd come home and it was almost like letting go of the mask. And he had so much kind of overwhelm there that binging and purging was a way to manage that.
Yeah.
So it could be that those symptoms are just more heightened, whereas anorexia is suppressed. Um, but hopefully, that will maybe be something that I will be looking into. But I think it is really interesting. And the more that I speak to people that have had anorexia and are diagnosed with ADHD, I also think that maybe people are starting to put the puzzle pieces together themselves now, which will lead to more research. Whereas I think before we very much have focused on autism and anorexia or autism and ARFID. So
Yes,
maybe the focus was there rather than thinking about ADHD.
100%. And I can't wait to watch. I'm so excited to have more research about it and awareness, it's something that does need to be spoken about more, and it's going to be on my radar next year. Like when I that going to that conference, the online conference, really lit that like metaphorical rocket up my arse to go, I need to speak about this more.
Mm.
Because I can see a moment there's not enough research and people talking about it, but if I'm not, it's kind of that. So just to kind of wrap up a little bit, and again, this is going to be definitely your experience because it is so individual. And I know you said you are still on like a journey of, and I do think that when you've gone, you know, decades with undiagnosed ADHD, and you said potentially I'm the same as you down the autism route as well, it isn't going to be this quick, okay, now I understand my brain, now I can get on with life. I think it is going to be a constant state of learning and refining, and I actually see that as a bit of a project. That's how I like to look at it and reframe it. But if we look at the food side of it, because you battled anorexia for a long time, and then there was like the masking of it through, and the like the pursuit of control with like the powerlifting and things. What have you found now has helped to have that healthier and more positive relationship with food? Are there any sort of strategies, anything that you found's been really supportive? Just it would be interesting to hear what's, because again, this is so unique, as is the tools of recovery, but the way that we cope in day to day. So what do you feel has helped you the most?
Mm. I think that's a really interesting question. And just before I say that, I really like what you said about, it's a continuous journey because I remember speaking to somebody who said, I don't think that I'll ever be fully recovered because you're always recovering. And at the time, I was like, I don't like that. Like, I want there to feel like there's an end point. And I think I disagree slightly, but I think because just the terminology recovering, but I think that we are continually learning and continually growing. And, I have days where I am feel really, really bad. And or I just think, you know what, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back to the eating disorder. It'll make everything better. Everything was better when I was ill. But then I very quickly turn that around. And that to me is the sign of recovery. It's like how you will have the disordered thought sometimes. We all have kind of, negative thoughts sometimes, but it's how quickly you recognize that, reach out for help and do, implement things that you know will help yourself. Um, but in terms of recovery, I think when people ask me this, I feel so harsh in saying it, because this comes from the most compassionate place in the world because I've had an eating disorder in my life for, I say 14 years because I was diagnosed, but it was definitely been longer. So I know it's not an easy process, but you kind of just have to do it.
Yeah.
And I know that that sounds really, really harsh, but I remember my therapist saying to me, um, I'd gone to a therapy session. I was like, yeah, so I'm doing really well on like day-to-day eating and my weight's maintained and like exercise isn't as impulsive anymore. And, I'm finding different passions, but I really want to go out for brunch and not have a safe food. I want to have something that's actually delicious. And she was like, well, go and do it then.
Yeah.
And I was like, can we not just talk about it? And she was like, no, we can talk about it till the cows come home. But what I need you to do is go and do it and then come back to me and we can process what's happened and we can talk about it so that next time it feels easier. And I think, I'm not saying go from doing, if you're in an eating disorder right now to like, whatever vision you have of full recovery, that's not going to happen. But taking those small steps every single day, like I was very much, each meal felt incredibly difficult, but even adding the tiniest thing to each meal at the time, I was like, how is this helping me? Because this is just like a tiny little amount. But then over time, you realize that adding that tiny little amount each time then just kind of becomes your normality. And then you're at a point where you've kind of doubled your meal plan. And that, back in the day would have felt terrifying, but because you've done it over time and you've kept at it,
Yeah.
you've got to start somewhere basically. And, I think for me, that it was terrifying and it was scary. And I used to say to myself, the worst thing in the world is going to happen. That's why anorexia recovery is so difficult because your biggest fear is going to happen and you don't know when that's going to stop and you can't control when that's going to stop. But I think the more that you lean into recovery and go about it, as I was saying earlier, you realize that there's so much more to life than what you were worried about before. Like I was always worried about, gaining weight or what have you. And now, yes, I have gained weight, but that means that I can go to dance lessons with my friends. It means that I can go to raves and I can, dance until 3 a.m. and be able to do that without being really ill. And
Absolutely.
we actually went to a wedding a few weeks ago. And the last wedding that we'd been to, I was really, really unwell. And I didn't really eat all day because, the food was optional. They were just handing around canapes or what have you. And it got to like 10 o'clock at night and everyone was really drunk. And I just felt so ill. Like I couldn't really stand up because I felt so ill. And at the time, I just thought that I was ill. And then looking back now, I was like, no, that was the eating disorder getting in the way of everything. And so being at this wedding just now and being so engaged and having fun and taking pictures and eating the food and everything, it just really made me realize when you're in it, you don't realize what you're missing out on until you get to the point where you're engaging in it and you're like, wow. So I think like small incremental steps is definitely the way that I did it because also I hate change. And so if you do big changes, you will just kind of you'll try it and then you'll think, oh my God, this is terrifying and run back to what you know is safe. So if you do little steps, that really helps. And then in terms of like actual kind of helpful things for ADHD, I or I was really wanting to completely open up my food choices, but I knew that that would be a very overwhelming thing to do. So again, I did small incremental steps there and kind of, keeping it so that my meals were quite similar each day, but just adapting something slightly so that there was a bit of that feels slightly uncomfortable, but it was still very manageable. And setting alarms really, really helped because I I don't really have the time blindness that a lot of people speak about. But I would recognize the time and be like, no, I'm not doing it. So having the alarm just really kind of, was like, Hannah, come on, you can do this.
Yeah.
Um, and also reaching out for support as well to friends and family, because I think when I was initially trying to recover, I just wanted to do it on my own and asking my partner for help. I didn't want him to become my carer, and because our relationship was on the rocks, I really was like, I don't want to burden him or what have you. But asking for help with things like a food shop, making sure that you have snacks that are easily accessible, maybe meal prepping or having foods for meals that is easily accessible. So you've not kind of got the, oh, I can't be bothered, or you've got the decision fatigue of what to eat. And having people sit with you at meals, I found that really helpful as well. And I would say to people, like, if you see me struggling, don't talk about it at the meal. Like if you see me struggling, just start talking about like hybrid minds or like glitter or rainbows. Like just talk about something that I'll love, or just bring up the news or what have you, because that will distract me. And then after the meal, we can talk about why that was slightly difficult. Because if we talk about it when I'm eating,
Right.
that meal isn't going to get eaten. So yeah, I think to summarize the long waffle,
That's fantastic.
having foods that are easily accessible was a top one to reduce the decision fatigue. Having help from other people, whether that is going to the shops, cooking, or eating with you, and then small incremental steps.
What's really interesting, and I've never had this light bulb until literally now, was when I was going through the thick of it, had a very like structured like plan to follow. And I very much had pretty much the same thing, but just like small variations every day. And I just thought this is just keeping it easy for me. But now I realize why that worked so well for me, rather, and then why I found like the big changes so hard. So that was really interesting. So you've touched on it briefly, but obviously what you're doing and the work you're doing for the field and industry is absolutely amazing. So what is like the vision for this? 'Cause I know you've obviously got the business, you've got the podcast, but when you think about starting this, what is the mission that you are on ultimately? Is it to raise awareness? Is it to get the research in? Like if you were to retire, how would you know that you've achieved your purpose and mission with the work that you're doing?
I think so. I think ADHD, I really struggle with questions like this because it's really funny, when people say, oh, live in the moment, like, should, what have you. I live in the moment so much that I have like object permanence about before and after. Like, I cannot vision the future or like think about how the past has implicated me. I'm very like in the moment, but
Sure.
equally not in the moment because I'm worrying about what's going to happen in a second. So that question is difficult, but I think the reason why I first started Full of Beans was when I struggled, I felt so alone.
Yeah.
And I just thought nobody else has ever experienced this. Like I'm never going to be able to get support or live a life without this. And so I think the aim is to ensure that no one feels lonely and everybody knows that there is possible hope. And I've done the podcast in a way so that I speak to people with lived experience, but I also speak to their loved ones and their supporters. I also speak to researchers and I speak to clinicians. And when I kind of think about that, I was like, oh, should I just keep it to people with lived experience? But actually, I want people with lived experience to hear clinicians talk about their role in holding hope for their patients or their clients. And I want people with lived experience to hear about the research that's happening and people that are dedicating their work to them. But I equally want people like researchers and clinicians to hear what it's like to live with an eating disorder and what needs to change. So I've tried to kind of be the go-between the research and the clinicians and the people with lived experience, say, at the moment, there's a bit of a gap between everybody. Can we all come together so that what we're doing is helping each other? Because that's what we all fundamentally want to do.
Absolutely.
So I think when I retire, well, that I guess is a different question. My aim with the podcast is for people to feel less alone,
I love that.
but the dream for me, I guess, for when I retire would be to be the go-to gal for ADHD and anorexia, which feels terrifying to say and put that out there,
I
but
love it. You've got to put it out there. You've got to stop playing
got to
small.
manifest it.
Absolutely. And I'm quite similar in like the visions I've got with like wanting to be known for what I do. And I think it's so easy when you've played, you've kind of just bubbled under the surface your whole life to kind of just keep it safe. But I don't know you, but I've got to a point now I'm just like, nah, no, like this matters, so let's go big, let's go bold. But I'm very excited to follow along. It's something I'm very passionate about. Before I quickly let you share where people can find you and follow you and all that good stuff, I always just like to end on a fun question, light-hearted, fun, good vibes. That's why I don't prep you for it, because I don't want you to sit and analyze it and think about it too much, because that's what we'll do. So my question for you is, if ADHD was a color, what color would it be?
Ooh.
You can't get this wrong because there's no right or wrong.
I mean, for me, it's a rainbow.
Yeah,
Am I allowed that? Am I allowed to
I
have
have the same answer.
every?
So yes, I would.
Because for me, when I was a little girl, I used to wear these rainbow knee-high socks and I'd put my hair in eight plaits with glittery hair bubbles. And to me, that was the little girl that pre kind of masking that was trying to show herself. And I feel like, now, whenever I really embrace my ADHD and when I'm in a very comfortable position, I feel like a rainbow. I feel so sparkly and
Yes.
shiny and just, you know, pure and utter happiness. So, yeah, it's got to be a rainbow.
I love that. And oh my God, what you said about the rainbow socks. So this has just brought back one core memory. So when I used to do performing arts as a kid, I used to hate um and I know it's a sensory thing like the costumes. Like I remember getting anxiety about costume fittings and what it was going to look like and how it was going to feel. Like just used to hate it. But I remember when I was probably about 8 or 9, I was in the Wizard of Oz and I was one of the Munchkins. And one of the costumes was these knee-high rainbow socks. And I remember vividly that being one of the only items of clothing that I was excited to wear. The rest I hated, and I was like,
Yeah.
oh, get it off. But I loved those. I remember keeping them. My mum's like, what are you gonna do with them? I'm like, I don't know, but I love them. And
Keep
it's
them
just so
forever.
funny you've said that because I'm like, it's
Yeah.
ADHD, isn't it? It's rainbow knee-high socks. But thank you so much for your time, Hannah. This has been so valuable and absolutely amazing. So for anyone listening, and obviously I'll put this in the description and stuff as well, can you just let people know where they can find you on social media platforms, etc.?
Course, yeah. So for the podcast, it's full of beans, and that's literally on every platform that you could listen to. And then most of the stuff that I post is on Instagram, so it's underscore we are full of beans. So if you want to check that out, and if anything resonates, feel free to drop me a message. But honestly, thank you so much for having me. It's been so lovely to chat, and I love it. I find it so interesting because people always like, as I've said today, you feel so different. But then when you meet someone that's also got ADHD, you're like, huh, maybe we're not so different.
At all. We're all out there. It's just finding each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah, once again, thank you, Hannah. Go drop her a follow. And for everyone else, I will catch you on the next episode.